Hi guys, this is Twila with the Facebook group Soapmaking with Natural Ingredients forum, and today we're just going to do a short 10-15 minute video that goes over some of the basic soap making equipment that you will need to get started and some cheaper alternatives so that you don't have to go out and invest a lot of money right at the start. Just some things you may have sitting around the house that you can use. And we're also going to touch on the basic safety equipment that you need to get started. Okay, now if you bear with me, I've got to adjust my camera here a little bit by myself. There we go. I think you can see what I need to show you there. To start with, you're going to need some kind of a scale to measure your ingredients. Any recipes that you find that are listed in cups or half cups or anything like that, you really need to convert that into either grams or ounces to work with. So when I first started, I had this cheapy little thin scale, worked fine. The only problem with this is that it doesn't handle a large quantity of oil. So as you start to make bigger batches, you may want a sturdier scale than that. But your basic things that you want to have in a scale, there's two basic things. So this is now the scale that I use. You want a scale that has measurements, different measurements that you can use. So this scale, for instance, has grams, ounces, pounds, kilograms, and you can adjust how you're weighing, what measurement you're using by the touch of a button. The other thing you want is what's called a tare button. The tare button allows you to zero out the weight of whatever's on the scale. So when you put a container on the scale, it's going to show what the container weighs. Well, you don't want that when you're measuring ingredients. So you're going to hit the tare button, and that zeroes it out. And now all it's going to weigh is whatever you pour into that ingredient, into that container, or whatever ingredient you place into that container. When you first start out, you will probably want a bunch of individual little containers, and to ensure that I wasn't missing ingredients or forgetting things, I would measure each ingredient into a separate container by itself. Then before I started mixing everything together, I would double check my recipe and make sure that I hadn't forgotten anything. So these worked really good for that. These were little dollar store containers, very cheap. But as you get going, then you may find that you can put a larger container on your scale, hit the tare button, pour your first ingredient in until you hit the appropriate measure, then tare it again, pour in your second ingredient. That way you're individually measuring each ingredient accurately. But the problem with that is when you first start out, you may be a little shaky, you may not have a real good feel for how different ingredients pour out of containers. So I recommend at first that you definitely start with some individual little containers to measure all your ingredients. The next thing you're going to need is something to mix both your lye and your oils in. So these were my first containers, and I invested in these, and they were a good investment. However, you don't have to. These are stainless steel and well worth the investment. I used the smaller one as my lye pitcher, and I used the bigger one to put my oils in, and it had enough room that I could then pour my lye into those containers. But you don't have to have anything as high-tech as stainless steel. You can go to the dollar store and pick up like this little cheap set of different size bowls. Was very cheap at the dollar store. Anything like that you can use. As you start making bigger batches, you may want to upgrade and go to a bigger size pot or whatever you need to accommodate your recipes. I do recommend for your lye that you either use stainless steel or one of the tougher plastics. Some of the juice pitchers that you can buy at the dollar store that you mix juices in are good alternatives. Don't use glass. Glass can be degraded by the lye over time, and eventually when you're just using a glass measuring cup, it can just shatter and scatter your lye everywhere, and you'd be at a big risk for burns. So I don't recommend using glass at all. The next thing you're going to need is when you actually have your lye mixed, when you're pouring your lye into your oils, you should always use a strainer. And again, use stainless steel for anything that's going to touch your lye. Don't use aluminum or those type metals. So that's just a simple strainer. And all that's for is in case there's the odd lye crystal that's left in your pitcher that didn't fully dissolve, you're going to catch it in the strainer and it won't go into your soap and give you a gob of lye sitting there in your soap that could cause a burn. These are wonderful tools to have. They're silicone spatulas. They work great. You sort of need one bigger one. I love these little ones. You don't have to have them, but they are really wonderful. Something you may want to invest in once you start soaping a bit. But they're great for scraping out a little container and getting all of your last little bit of oil and everything out of your small containers. And some of these, even this one is more of a spoon looking utensil. So that's really good for helping to scoop out it when you get to the point that you may be separating your batter and coloring different parts of your batter. It doesn't hurt to have a whisk, either stainless steel whisk, or you can get plastic coated whisks too that work fine. I find the stainless steel is a little bit sturdier. You will need a stick blender. You don't have to have a stick blender. You can stir totally by hand, but you're going to look at a much longer process to get your soap to trace. When I first started out, I didn't want to purchase anything brand new. I went to a flea market, and this, as you can tell, is slightly damaged, and it was at the flea market, I think, for $1.50. And it worked wonderfully. I used that for over a year with no issues. I still occasionally use it. The one drawback to this type of stick blender is that it doesn't detach, so when you're washing it up, you have to be careful that you don't submerge the upper part, because that's where your motor is. Once you get making some soap, if you decide that this is something you're going to continue, you may want to invest in one of these style stick blenders that the bottom comes off. You can drop that right in your sink to be washed, and you don't have to worry about the motor part. But you certainly don't need that when you first start out. Make sure that you either have lots of paper towels on hand, or if you're worried about the environment, just lots of rags to mop up spills, that type of thing. Those are a must-have. You do not have to have fancy molds. This is a silicone mold. Obviously, it's bought and not cheap. This is a wooden mold, and if you do opt to go with a wooden mold, you will need freezer paper or something like that to cover your wood with. This is another type of a silicone mold. But you, like I said, you don't need to invest in those. Some quick things that you may have around the house that you could use is something as simple as a cut-out milk carton. That works very well. Little yogurt containers that you've emptied out works perfectly fine to use to make an individual little mold. Round chip canisters, they work great to make an individual mold. To make a loaf mold. They work wonderful. So you don't need to invest in expensive molds right off the bat. If you're going to be using essential oils, you should definitely use a glass container. The glass containers are safer for essential oils. If you were to pour essential oils in styrofoam or even some plastics, the styrofoam, if you set that down and turn your back for a few minutes, it's going to eat the whole bottom out of the styrofoam cup, and your oils are going to be everywhere. And it will do that in plastic as well. So I invested at the dollar store in these little glass beakers, and that's what I use for my essential oils, and they work wonderful. As far as safety equipment goes, some of your basics are you definitely want a pair of goggles. These are the most basic type of goggles that you can get. You can get ones that seal right to your face. I have a problem with those because I have a tendency to steam those up something terrible, so I stick with these. Some people use a whole face shield. You can purchase those as well, and that would be a really good alternative. If you wear glasses, and I know this from personal experience because I damaged a pair of lenses, although they do offer slight protection against light splatters into your eyes, you should still cover your glasses with protective eyewear. Number one, because it's double protection, and these have the side piece, which typical prescription glasses don't have. But number two, any light splatters that land on your prescription lenses, if your lenses have any type of a coating on them, like an anti-glare or anti-scratch coating, lye can actually eat that away. I've actually had that happen to a pair of glasses. So basic goggles you need. You need some gloves. I prefer these thinner gloves. These you can purchase at the drugstore, like medical gloves, or a lot of mechanic supply places carry them as well. I find I have better control with these. They're very thin. I don't find them bulky at the end of my fingers. I don't find I have a tendency to drop things with them on. Some people use the longer sleeved gloves like you would wash dishes with, and that's fine if it works for you. I just found them a little bulky on my fingers. Make sure when you're soaping that you wear long sleeves that you can pull down. You do not want exposed skin at all. The other thing that's a good option, it isn't necessary, but I do like it, is some type of a respirator. These work really well when you're working with the lye fumes. There are fumes that the lye gives off. I typically go outside when I mix my lye, where the air can circulate a bit better, and I don't have any issues. And if I'm outside, I don't wear this. I do well. If it's a really nasty day and I have to mix my lye inside, I put this on. If you are going to be using essential oils, it's a good idea when you're working with essential oils to wear some type of a respirator. You can build up sensitivities, and this will help prevent that. If you already have sensitivities, you could go with the respirators, the big facial ones that fit your face really tight, and they have the big circle on each side with the filters. They're probably, a much more secure option than this for filtering out as much as possible. But I stick with these, and these were very cheap at my dollar store. The other thing, I typically wear an apron, as you can see here, just to protect your clothes. It isn't absolutely necessary, but it does help protect your clothes. And when you are working with your lye, you should definitely not be in sandals. It's a good idea to be totally covered, your foot to be totally covered with your footwear. The other thing that you should keep in mind is to make sure that you don't have any children or pets under your feet when you're working with lye. Put your pets outside, lock them in the bedroom or in their crate, whatever you do to protect them. And kids, either make sure that they're old enough that they can be off in another room playing by themselves, or that you soap when they go to bed, or that your partner is there and can tend your children while you're soaping. I just wanted to point out two other basic ingredients that every soap is going to use, and that is lye and water. I typically buy my lye at the hardware store. I don't buy it from a soaping supply company, although you can. But the one thing you need to watch if you buy your lye from a hardware store is read your label and make sure that somewhere on that label it says that it's 100% pure lye. You do not want anything that has any other additives. And some of the drain cleaners or that you find in a hardware store will have other additives. So make sure that somewhere on that label it tells you that it's 100% lye. As long as that's what it is, it will make beautiful soap. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. Distilled water. You definitely should be using distilled water in your soaps. Now that is a controversial topic. Some people will say, I've never used distilled water. I've always used my well water. My well water is great. And that may be the case. But there is always some trace minerals in well water, and those type of things can contribute to what is called DOS, or dreaded orange spots in soap. You may not see it in the first 3 months that your soap is curing, or at the 6-month mark, but sometimes at the year mark or a bit later, all of a sudden you'll go and look at your soap and there'll be these ugly orangey brown spots all over your soap, and that could be caused from mineral deposits in using your well water. So if you start with distilled water, you eliminate that problem. Now there are other things that do cause DOS in soap. Just the water is not the only cause, but somebody will probably go into that in another video. But just to sort of ensure that that doesn't happen, use the distilled water. And one other thing that isn't absolutely necessary, but I think I probably should touch on it, is the use of a thermometer when you're making your soap. Initially, when you start making soap, you're going to be monitoring the temperature a little bit. Not that it has to be right to the degree or anything like that, but until you get familiar with wow, that's too hot to soap with, or yeah, that's sort of lukewarm temperature, that's a good temperature to soap with, or it's room temperature, that's great. You should start with a thermometer. This was the first thermometer I bought, again from the dollar store, very cheap. Not the most convenient, but it worked fine. I would use it, I would stick it in my pot with my oils, see what my oil temperature was, have a piece of paper towel, wipe it off, then stick it in my lye pot and see what that was. And it worked fine. Very cheap, worked great. However, I do recommend at some point, if you get into soaping and you really enjoy it and you're going to be doing it long term, I think one of these infrared thermometers is an excellent tool to purchase. You don't have to actually come in contact with any liquid, so you don't have to be wiping it off. It's so convenient, like you just point and click and it reads your temperature and it shows up here on this little screen what your temperature is. So although not necessary to invest in this right at the start, a nice tool down the road. Anyway, I hope that this gives you some basic idea of what you need to get started and some cheaper alternatives that you can use, and also that you remember not to neglect the safety aspect of it. It's something that if you start to get a little slack with, you very quickly can regret it. And some people have experienced some really bad burns on their body from being a little slack. So try not to get in that habit. Try right from the start to use all your safety measures. Anyway, happy and safe soaping, and bye for now.